Hi, my name is Christina Suter, and I have owned over $50 million worth of real estate, and I've owned 4 different apartment buildings, all which had needed turnarounds of some kind, whether it's rehabs or whether it's tenants, or whether it's property management companies, or whether it's just a lemon building. So let me talk to you. Over the years, I've invested and owned multi-unit families and residential units. 4 primary problems that I have noticed that multifamily buildings can have. And hopefully this will make it super simple for you guys, easy to work out. So again, ChristinaSuter.com, 4 primary ways a multifamily building can go wrong. Okay, first let's talk about what is a perfect building, or a building that is at least working really, really well. They're hitting their target cash flow. Cash on cash is working exactly the way you expect it to and you calculated it to. They're hitting your target annual capital appreciation, as in the neighborhood that you've invested in and the larger city that you've chosen to buy that building in is appreciating the way you expect it to. Now, there are some ways to anticipate what appreciation is going to be in a neighborhood, not just based upon the historical, but knowing that you actually have growing population in that area. You have 4 primary industries that are feeding that area. So if you lose one, it doesn't destroy the area. That you have a mix of population that you want to have as tenants and that other people will want to have as tenants. That you have a crime rate that's within an acceptable bracket. These are just 4 primary things I look at: growing population, unemployment rate, mix of population, mix of industry. Your vacancy factor is below 8%. There are some states where specifically your vacancy factor will be higher than 8%. Texas, I'll mention Texas, can be higher than 8%, and that can be a pain in the ass. But office will also, previous to this COVID problem, office still had a relatively high vacancy rate in relationship to multifamily. But the vacancy factor, I prefer to be below 8%. So I want to be in a part of the city where there's enough demand for that apartment building and for those units that the vacancy factor is tight, below 8%. 8% isn't that tight, guys, but 8% is completely acceptable. Your expense ratios are below 40%. Now, expense ratios are something where truly you will find that the expense ratios end up being defined not just by your neighborhood, but also defined by the deferred maintenance on your building. So if you buy a deferred maintenance building, there's a whole series of steps that I have for you and suggestions I have for you on how you turn around or how you prepare a deferred maintenance building for long-term ownership so that you're not being nickel and dime and the building can perform better. But I like to have the expense ratio below 40% if I can, or force it to below 40%. The difficulty next is there are no chronic problems. It'd be great if there's no chronic problems. Every building I have bought, by the way, has a chronic problem built into it. Now, I prefer to buy a building that has a D, a distressed, a distressed or something that is not working inside the building. I know there's another D in there, but I can't think of it right now. But there are no chronic problems. I've had gangs. I've had lead tenants that are willing to rally up all the other tenants to work against me. I've had problems with my management company. I've had problems with deferred maintenance on buildings. So a perfect building has no chronic problems in it. You have successful tenants that are enjoying living there, that are loyal to your property management company and to you. That's great. That would be a perfect, ideal building. Do I ever have any of those? Anyway, let's put it this way. Let me say it this way. Have I ever bought any of those? No, I've never bought any of those. I've never bought a perfect building. Now, here's the problem with me and a perfect building. The reason why I don't buy a perfect building is because they generally cost more. They're cash flowing well. They don't have any chronic problems. The apartment building is completely full. Vacancy factor is great. They're in a strong capital appreciation target area. Doesn't have to be off the charts, but 2%, 4% can be lovely, and they're hitting their cash on cash returns. That building is an A grade building or is a positive performance building, and those buildings are more expensive to buy. Their cap rate is lower. You have to pay more for it per door. So I like buying buildings that have problems. So when I talk about having 4 primary areas where you have problems with your building, this is based on the experience of me buying buildings that I know have problems. Moving on. Okay, Maintenancing of your building. How do you know that you're having a problem? One of the ways you know you're having a problem in a multifamily building is you have to intervene a lot. You constantly are getting texts, calls, or emails from your property management company telling you about another problem, another difficulty, another incident in the building. So I have this building, specifically it was right next door to a gang building. I did not know that the gang members lived in the apartment building right next door to the building I had just purchased. I had a lot of conversations about kids in the parking lot, young men, young women in the parking lot, cars being broken into, trash being dumped in front of my building, gang tagging in the back of the building, right? That was just from the neighborhood, from the neighbors next door. And then I had trash in the building itself. People were not dumping properly into the trash cans. They would run up and down the halls. The hall was kind of scary. And so I had to fix that. Like literally people were complaining about the hall itself because it was kind of scary. And then you ended up with a noisy building. So this is me having to intervene a lot. So literally it was every week, every other week, there was a project that needed to be taken care of that I was being looped in on because the cost of fixing it was extensive enough that it hit the price threshold of them having to reach out to me, or it was complex enough having to do with tenant management or the building next door that they needed to reach out to me in order to reach out to the police department or reach out to other problems, other ways of finding solutions to these problems. So I was having to intervene a lot. So if you have a building where you're intervening once a week, twice a week, that is a building where I would suggest you're having a problem in the building and you want to think about, how do I solve that problem? Cash flow is sporadic or inconsistent or no cash flow at all. So literally what I mean by that is when you own a building over a long period of time, year, longer, 3 years, 5 years, and you're not turning the building around. You're not intentionally vacating units in order to rehab units, in order to turn the building around to a higher performing building. You own the building and it should be consistent in its cash flow because that's what you purchased or that's your intention for the building. But cash flow is sporadic, inconsistent, or no cash flow at all. I will tell you specifically how to find some solutions to what can be the quote unquote invisible cause to that, and how you solve that problem where your cash flow is sporadic, inconsistent, or no cash flow at all. Because there are many layers to that particular conversation and how to solve it, but it is solvable. At least you can figure out what it is. Bad news tenants. Definitely had some bad news tenants. Bad news tenants. I told you I had a ringleader tenant who specifically got the other tenants against me. I've had a drug dealer in my building. I have had gangs next door to my building, which I've already told you about. I have had a tenant that refused to leave and constantly, chronically complained about the condition of their apartment and wanting new stuff. Their carpet was less than 5 years old. They wanted new carpet. They wanted the interior of their units to be repainted. And they will reach out to the tenant rights in order to try to encourage me to fix the things that were in their unit. But even tenants rights had a hard time supporting them because they were asking for things that were outside even the tenants rights codes. So bad news tenants come in many different forms and many different ways. Most buildings have at least one bad news tenant, but that can be managed over time. It's when you have tenants that are creating bad news beyond themselves, or they're affecting the culture of the building itself, such as my drug dealer definitely affected the culture of the building itself. Gang activity. Told you about that one already. High vacancy factor. If your vacancy factor goes higher than 15%, that generally is a clear and distinct communication that there is something wrong in your building that the tenants themselves are not content with. And if your property management company has not brought it to your attention, your property management company is also, I feel like, withholding what you need to know. If you have a vacancy factor higher than 15%, there is something triggering that. And I've had that happen. So I'm just telling you that I've noticed it happens in reality, that you get a vacancy factor seemingly all of a sudden in 6 months where you have more than 15% vacancy in the building. Remember, you want your building to be less than 8% vacancy. You want to buy in a neighborhood, hopefully, where you can have less than 8% vacancy. So if you have higher than 15% vacancy in a short period of time, that is feedback. There's a problem in your building. And or the building is half empty, which is what has happened to me, when I had my gang problem and they were breaking into the cars and they were dealing drugs into my parking lot. Really good example of how you can have a problem in a building that will create a higher than 15% vacancy when you have that type of chronic issue occurring inside your building and tenants just going, this is not being remediated, this is not being solved, we're leaving. And they definitely got a 50% vacancy factor in that very short 4 to 6 month period. That is feedback to you. It's an example of how that can happen. And you have major repairs coming up. How do you maintain or be prepared for major repairs? Repairing the roof, repairing the primary AC unit, both are major repairs. Replacing plumbing because the plumbing is galvanized and you want it to be copper. Or replacing electrical because you find the electrical is not serving the amount of tenants or the need that the tenants have for electricity. Literally, it's not just knob and tube, guys. You will have an apartment building where the electricity is not the main box is not supplying enough electricity to then support today's needs for electricity. Did I mention I buy older buildings? Buy buildings that are built in 1960s or earlier, and that ends up being a problem. 1980s buildings, you don't have this sort of electricity problem very often, but you will in slightly older buildings where the panel is just not big enough to support the refrigerator, the computers, the electricity, the lights, the games and gadgets, the TVs. All of these have higher electrical draws than we used to have when we were building buildings in the 60s. So you will need to sometimes simply upgrade the panel itself to be able to manage the amount of draw that your tenants are requiring or using in today's units. So this is maintenancing buildings. Do you notice if you have a problem in any of these areas, that's part of how you can identify that you have a problem building. How do you fix it? I'm going to do that in the next video. Christina Suter, a real estate investment advisor, helping you discover your real purpose through real estate.